Good morning. I feel like I'm following on from the children's message a little bit by pointing out that I saw something come across my screen over the weekend. Kenneth Copeland, who is a famous televangelist and prosperity gospel minister. You can often find Kenneth Copeland if you're looking for him on the Trinity Broadcasting Network and some other places. I personally am not often looking for Kenneth Copeland when I'm relaxing on my couch, but I saw a video of him as he was getting into the back of his Bentley limousine the other day. An interviewer approached him and was asking him about his and his ministry's finances. And he was on the way to the airport to get into one of his ministry's Gulfstream jets because they have more than one. He was asked about his life of luxury as a preacher of the gospel. It's painful to watch this interview. He's caught by surprise by the interviewer as he's standing by the limousine in his well-tailored suit. And he attempts to distract the female interviewer who is asking some basic questions by saying things like, "You have really nice eyes." He calls her baby and sweetheart. And it doesn't work at all. She doesn't take the bait. She doesn't allow the interview to become about her and her response to him. She stays on task and continues to ask follow-up question after follow-up question, rhetorically handing Copeland more and more rope. And she finally cuts to the heart of the matter, and she says, "Doesn't Jesus say that it is harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich person to go to heaven?" And Copeland stops, and he smiles, and his eye takes on the familiar twinkle. "Ah, yes, you're quoting the scripture. But it also says, all things are possible for God." Big smile. He just took the ball, he senses, and did a slam dunk. Interview over. Let's go to the airport. Because the text does say that, right? In verse 27, the text says something really quite close to that. There are days when I wish Martin Luther was around in this day and age, so that I could hear about how he would speak to the gospel of prosperity. If you want a flavor of Luther's tongue lashings, you can seek out articles entitled things like Martin Luther's Sickest Burns, which include him once calling an opponent a bungling magpie. I love that term. Luther had much to say about the way in which the church spoke about money in the Middle Ages. On the one hand, he despised the way in which the institutional church, much like Copeland's ministry, seemed to enrich the priests and the landowners at the top of the pyramid to the detriment of everyone else. But importantly, Luther also despised the ethic that came from the other end of the spectrum as well. To some monks who believed that in this text, Jesus was telling anyone who could to renounce all of their possessions, Luther said they were fanatics and hypocrites who liked to walk around barefoot to let everyone else know that they had taken on vows of poverty. Luther saw no honor in this because it smacked to him of a works righteousness. You're trying to get your way into heaven by doing something to prove your piety. But also Luther knew that the system was rigged. While common folk are toiling in the fields to harvest the wheat that will make the bread that the priests in the monastery eat, the workers in the field have to stress out about there being enough food for their own families, while the priests in the monastery have every essential need satisfied. Now, we might well be disgusted with the way that a modern preacher like Copeland uses the scripture to justify his beyond luxurious lifestyle. Luther highlights that we are also typical uncomfortable with an ethic of renunciation, giving up all of one's possessions in order to live a more pure or spiritual life. And so very often, intentionally or not, we find ourselves in that mushier middle where articulating a firm ethic becomes quite complex. Because, of course, many of us believe, as Luther did, that it is good and right for our children to have a place to play, for us to provide them with a roof over their heads and access to books, that it is good and right to have a place for vegetables to grow, while also believing at the same time that the name of the game is not to take all that we can from whomever we can, to get all that we can, and keep all that we can. Because I'm guessing that every single person here believes to some degree or another that it is right to help others, that it is good to provide for the essential needs of others. And so over the next couple of weeks, we are turning our attention to the ways in which Christians have thought about money and finances and investments. And my task over the next couple of weeks is to ensure that there is a scriptural and theological base to this conversation, asking that if we are a community that has not engaged in an ethic of renunciation of all possessions, and at the same time are bewildered by the gospel of prosperity, then what of our ministry? What does it mean to minister to others, as our statement of purpose articulates, using our financial resources ethically, mindfully, and creatively? Whose ethics are we drawing from? Which ethics are we attempting to articulate? My discussion is intended to prompt us to think about the direction that we as a church wish to take, what arc we might hold to be moral and ethical for the congregation, rather than me telling you what to do with your money as individuals and families, because I promise you, I know how that feels. I really do know what it is like to sit in the pews and squirm as a preacher tells you how you should think about your own bank account. The conversation about the church's financial investments over the next couple of weeks is intended to create opportunities for us to think, discover, and discern. And then perhaps those things may influence how we as individuals and families think about our values and our finances. So, on the face of it, Luke 18 does seem to offer some fairly clear directions to the man who is seeking Jesus out in this story, known as the rich young ruler. He's been a good guy all his life, but the cherry on top of the sundae from Jesus is now he has to renounce all of his possessions. The monks in Luther's day see this instruction, and you can understand perhaps where they are coming from. It's the holy path to take. It's the moral path to take. And the eye of the needle saying from Jesus only seems to confirm this approach, right? It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a wealthy person to enter the kingdom of heaven, as Katrina rightly pointed out. Understanding what that means is probably another sermon all by itself. We seemingly are confronted with whether to take this teaching literally or at least seriously. Some folks have attempted to suggest that a camel could pass through the eye of a needle quite easily because there was a gate or an opening in the wall in Jerusalem called the Eye of the Needle that required a fully laden camel to stoop down in order to get through it, or one had to take all of its goods off of its back in order for it to squeeze through the opening. And you can see how appealing that might be for people of any sort of financial means, because it suggests that camels pass through the eye of needles all the time. If you just stoop a bit, you'll make it through. Now, I don't find that particularly compelling for many reasons, one of which is that Luke's original audience is not in Jerusalem. They are hundreds of miles away, and the interpretation relies upon them knowing about one particular small gate on the outskirts of another city. It's also extremely convenient to the modern interpreter, right? And lastly, it also suggests that people in antiquity in Jerusalem didn't know how to build walls, which strikes me as a bit off. What about the young ruler himself? On the one hand, it is very impressive that he seems to have kept all the commandments since his youth. He is typically understood to be an impressive individual who's done very well in life and in business, perhaps. So impressive as, like the camel stooping down to get through the eye of the needle, it's a bit too good to be true. Like a first-century version of an Instagram picture, this young man has managed things perfectly thus far, a little too perfectly. In fact, so perfectly that Luther, in commentating on this story in the 16th century, heaps scorn on this rich young ruler. He practically laughs off his seat at the falls off his seat in laughter, at the stupidity, he claims, of a person pretending to be a humble follower of Jesus who would openly proclaim to Jesus Christ. It's one thing to tell your mother that you've been a good boy, but to go to Jesus Christ and say, I have kept all of the commandments, not just this morning or over the last couple of days, but since my youth. Luther says, incredibly sarcastically, well, ring all of the bells. How wonderful it must have been to be this guy's parents. They never had to discipline him. How wonderful. For Luther, the story starts with someone coming to Jesus under entirely false pretenses. In Mark's version of the story, the young man at least comes to Jesus and bows before him as an attempt at humility. Here in Luke, he just walks on up and he inserts himself and without a moment of reflection claims that he has obeyed all of the commandments pretty much his whole life long. And so what follows is Jesus not setting an ethic of renunciation for the church and for all followers for the rest of time. It is a laser-like focus on the man's conceit at believing that he's got it all figured out already. One thing you still lack, he says. One thing, perhaps a little tongue-in-cheek. And indeed, I think some of us can relate to this teaching, if he is indeed relatively young. For me, at least, the further I go in my vocation, what opens up to me is both that I have accumulated some knowledge along the way, but that knowledge has revealed to me how little I actually know. I now know that the greatest irony ever bestowed on a seminary student is that they receive the degree of Master of Divinity. What a hoot that is. And what's worse is that some of us come out of seminary believing that we have earned that title. Jesus' suggestion that the man should sell all of his possessions is a life-altering, paradigm-shifting claim on his whole life, which the young ruler suggests that he has mastered. His sadness that follows the request lays bare his self-deceit. Perhaps he didn't really want to know the truth about what he needed to do. He only wanted Jesus to confirm that, yes, he did have it figured out already. Which presents us with a disappointment and an opportunity. This story is in some ways a disappointment to me, a disappointment because it doesn't actually make things any easier for us. It doesn't clearly articulate an ethic, any sort of economic ethic around renouncing possessions in order to cure the world's ills, but it does suggest that there is the potential for the entanglement of money and self-deceit. It does also suggest later that the disciples who did give up everything have in fact chosen a wonderful spiritual journey for themselves. That in fact righteousness is theirs. But the text does not give us cut and dried rules to follow. It does not offer us much clarity. It doesn't make things clear for us. But it does therefore provide us with an opportunity to wrestle. Because before we ever talk about how we might understand money and investment, like the rich young ruler, we actually have to have a sense of what our priorities and our values are. Perhaps even our own understanding of what the purpose of life is. And that's a balancing act too. Because I completely agree with Luther that children ought to have a place to play and a roof over their heads and access to books and fruits and vegetables. Who doesn't believe that? I have a responsibility to provide for my children and my family. And I also, in success and privilege, have a responsibility to ensure that I don't blind myself to the essential needs of other people who also desire a place for their children to play, a roof over their heads, access to books, fruits, and vegetables. The economies of today, particularly our economy, is working well for some and plainly not for others. In our prosperity, instead of happiness, we find astonishing levels of anxiety. And as we have learned, particularly recently, astonishing levels of anxiety here in our own neighborhood among our children. That is a sermon all to itself. But in short, we know that rates of depression and anxiety are climbing, that life expectancy in some sectors of our society is declining, that eating disorders among young men are soaring, that the prospect of climate change is an essential ingredient to the anxiety that many young people experience, and that as a church, we must participate in potential remedies to the essential needs of others in everything that we do. And so next week I will talk about the history of the church and money. How has the church sought to address the problems of society, and what lessons can we learn in order to understand how we as a church should think about money and investment as a community. I do not leave you with answers this morning, just more wrestling. May it continue. Peace be with you.